I first came to the CDL 4 years ago, and it looked quite different than it does today. It was down the hall, 30 people in a small room, and that was it. And I was incredibly skeptical that anyone at a business school knew anything about how to build and scale a technology company. And today, I'm still probably skeptical if anyone at the business school knows how to build or scale a company. But what I've seen is that it's the people in this room, the fellows and the associates and the scientists that do know how to evaluate, build, scale, and finance these companies. And so I'd like to just start by thanking everyone in this room that's taken their time and put resources into building CDL into something that's not just 30 people in a room down the hall, but something that's now national and going, global effectively. So thank you for that. So we are also probably the first company that's come back to CDL again. And the reason we're here is because of the concept of advanced materials by design. So this is an email that's been framed on the wall of the CEO of Corning Glass. And it's an email from Steve Jobs that says, "We would not be where we are today without you and your team's amazing help." And so what he was referring to was, for the launch of the iPhone back in 2007, one of the critical materials that was required to make this possible was a new form of glass that would be strong and yet scratch resistant. And this is Corning Gorilla Glass. And so the folk story is that Steve Jobs phoned up Wendell and said 6 months before the iPhone launch, "We need this new material." And Wendell said, "Okay, well, we'll come up with something." And in 6 months, Corning pulled together and invented this new material. The reality is Corning had actually been developing that material since the 1960s. So more than 40 years of development. And in 6 months, they dusted it off and figured out how they could kind of thin it down and scale it up for the volumes that Apple required for the iPhone launch. And so we've seen that this one product, the iPhone, kind of revolutionized the world, took Apple from a small tech company to the world's largest company. And all of the innovation that's in there is powered by materials. So materials drive innovation. Without the glass, without the materials that make up the batteries, that make up the processors, the memory, we would not have anything today. But the reality is that materials take decades to develop. New compositions of matter are fundamentally very difficult to discover, very difficult to scale up, very difficult to prove in a manufacturing environment. Now, in 2007, there was also another important milestone, another important product release. And so there was this $2,500 11-inch TV released by Sony. This was the first organic LED mass consumer market display that was put out. And at the time, most people didn't know about it. But today, most people probably carry a cell phone in their pocket that uses an organic LED display, or wear it on their wrist or have it up on their wall in the form of a 65-inch TV from LG. But again, this technology was based on fundamental materials research that went back decades. First developed in its modern form at Eastman Kodak back in the 1980s, and actually that was based on materials research going back to the 1960s, done at the National Research Council of Canada in Ottawa. Another important milestone in 2007 was I started grad school. And there was this exciting technology coming out, this ability to build organic devices, displays using carbon-based dyes and pigments. And so I found that really exciting. And at the same time, looking at these major product announcements, and I was in the material science space, kind of recognizing that could we not just use materials to drive innovation, but can we actually solve large-scale industrial problems using materials? Could we take, for example, a material in an industrial process or in manufacturing, change one thing about it, and perhaps change the entire value chain, the entire cost structure, the entire capabilities of an entire industry? And so that was what our kind of research thesis was in grad school. And so we spent 6-7 years working on this. We ended up able to demonstrate in this specific field that in fact we could change one molecule, one material, and have profound impact downstream on reduce the number of manufacturing steps, bigger, better, cheaper, on a kind of massive scale with very small, minute atomic level changes in one material. And so we published this in big fancy journals, which is what you do when you're academics. And actually what's more exciting is we got on the front page of Engadget, which we were quite excited about because in those days it was quite a big deal. And large companies started approaching us and said, okay, this is very interesting technology. We want to acquire the technology. And we actually went down that path. And at the end of it, decided, no, we're going to stay, we're going to commercialize it, and we're going to start a company. And so we started OTI Lumionics to basically develop advanced materials to solve large-scale industrial problems in displays and lighting. And so a number of years later, we now have materials that are out being sampled by all of the top display manufacturers, all the consumer electronic companies that are going to allow them to build better, larger, cheaper displays. But the challenge is that that's taken us a decade to develop some of those initial sets of materials, which obviously we haven't broken that model of taking decades for new material research. And the reason it takes that long is that material science is based on this concept of looking at the structure of a material and figuring out what its properties are. And we know how to do that very well. We have very good models, very good understanding. But when we want to discover new materials, it's usually taking a list of required properties and converting that into a structure. And this is discovery. The problem is this is not a one-to-one problem. One set of properties could give us many different structures. And we actually don't know very well how those structure-property relationships work in reverse. And so what we've been doing over the last few years is applying, of course, as everyone likes to do these days, AI and machine learning to this problem. But the challenge there is that when we're trying to discover a new material, we have millions of examples of things that do not work, and we have 0 examples of things that do work. So as a result, we lack the fundamental data to actually prime the whole system and to be able to actually train a neural net or AI system to actually help us discover. And so what you acquire then is a way to generate data on your own, to be kind of self-priming. And so that's where this need for very complex simulations come in that allow us to both generate data and then validate internally in software without having to actually go out and measure things. And so what we effectively do is have this material discovery platform where we're able to take the specifications for a problem from different parts of the value chain, so from either the OEMs that build the consumer products, the panel makers that build the displays, the tool builders that build the equipment that goes in the factory, take those specifications, go through multiple iterations internally, and then ideally be able to turn back to them a material that's ready to go in mass production. So they can very seamlessly put it in, and we can avoid some of this decade-long development cycle and try to really accelerate things, because that whole loop in the middle, giving a material to a customer to sample and getting information back could be an 18-month timeline. So if I have to iterate 5 or 6 times on that, now we're talking about a decade just to get something into mass production. So the other piece, though, is that being able to generate the data by simulation isn't enough. Most things fail in mass production because a lab scale or kind of artificial environment is very different than a production environment. And so being based in Canada, we've been incredibly lucky that we've been able to bring in multi-million dollars of non-dilutive financing from the Canadian government and along with a number of very large multinational strategic partners to build a pilot demonstration facility where we can actually take these materials, discover them, scale them up, and then put them into a production environment and test how do they actually perform in an industrial setting and collect all that production data back and feed it back into the entire pipeline. And once we have that infrastructure in place, it lets us go one step further and take that production tool and actually build very simple products. And our goal is not to sell those products, but it's to put them out to market with a few partners, and then to collect the integration and the field trial data. So you have new materials. They may perform very different in a production environment, so we get that data back, and then you can put it into a real kind of product on a small scale and get all of that field trial testing back. And this helps to reinforce the entire platform and reduce the entire cycle down. So we have materials today using this that were discovered 6 months ago that are going out to sample to customers with positive feedback. But despite all of that, the bottleneck in this entire process is the simulation step. And this is because these fundamental structure-property relationships that we're looking at often deal with the fundamental quantum mechanical nature of atoms, molecules, and solids. And so in order to simulate them, we need incredible computational power. And in many cases, we're using a lot of tricks and approximations in order to even make this work. And we have to use supercomputers, and we have GPU clusters whizzing away. And even then, it's a pretty slow process. And so the reason we came back to CDL and sent our head of materials discovery, Scott Jenin, who's in the audience somewhere, yeah, over there, Scott. So was to basically look at, could we use the emerging field of quantum computing to run these simulations, or at least part of our simulation, better? And there was a lot of kind of hype and interest in using quantum computing to simulate materials, but very limited demonstrations to date. And the reason people are interested in it, us and others, is that when you look at the size of the problem you're trying to simulate and the required computing resources in classically done approaches, this scales exponentially with the size of the problem. So we can do small size problems. As it becomes large, suddenly we kind of run out of computing power. Versus the ideal quantum computing case is we're able to get linear, or in the worst case, polynomial scaling, which gives us a massive, massive speed up and cost advantage, which of course lets us do a much larger search space with these simulations. The one issue, though, with running these simulations on quantum hardware is that as the size of the problem gets larger, the number of so-called qubits that we need goes up. And so this is just an example from very small molecules like water all the way up to some much larger molecules that are actually industrially relevant in the OLED space and other material space. Now the challenge is this is where we are today in terms of the actual current state-of-the-art quantum hardware from IBM, Google, Microsoft, Rigetti, and a few other companies. And here we are today in terms of the state-of-the-art simulations demonstrated by IBM in a Nature publication at the end of last year. So they showed they could simulate hydrogen and beryllium hydride, not that well. It wasn't even chemically accurate, but it kind of worked. So we're obviously a few orders of magnitude away from being able to actually attack this problem of commercially relevant size problems running on real quantum hardware. And so the first thing we set out to do was look at, is there a way we can design an algorithm, a new approach to go through what we call qubit compression. So this is to take the problem, decompose it, compress it down, run it through the quantum hardware, and then uncompress it, and be able to run it on that hardware with less qubits. And if you can do this, the scaling is very nice, so that as the problem gets larger, the amount of compression goes up very, very, very significantly. So for something like water that'd be 14 qubits, you could maybe compress it 50% down to 7. But something that would take 500 qubits, you could potentially compress down to 70, which is now much closer to the range of kind of announced systems that are currently under development by most of the major hardware players. And so the goal when we went through CDL was to demonstrate if this was actually possible. And so we had to develop new theory and work with hardware partners in order to demonstrate this, and we were successful. So in the case of water, we were able to demonstrate that we could take 14 qubits and compress this down to 7 with minimal error. We did this on the Rigetti 19Q system. So I'd like to thank Rigetti for their partnership in the QML program. I think without the support of the hardware partners, it wouldn't have been possible for us to access this hardware as easily and to be able to test this. And so this has gone up in, there's a much larger publication around this on Archive earlier this week. Within the first day of it being published, there was already the quantum team at Google and some of the other large companies downloading this, distributing it internally, and starting to comment on the importance and significance of this work. And so we believe that we're very close to the cusp now, is that as the hardware continues to develop, we'll be able to apply the same algorithms that we've demonstrated on a larger scale on the simulators directly onto that hardware. But those are all these universal gate-based systems. So that's kind of where all the excitement has been, people talking about what IBM, Google, Rigetti's doing. But there's this other small company out in Vancouver called D-Wave that builds this other architecture. It's not a universal quantum computer. It's not based on gates. It's based on this quantum annealing process. And what's nice about it is that it's far more mature. So it's been under development for decades. And where, for example, the IBM system and Rigetti have 1920 qubits, D-Wave has more than 2,000. But the problem is that the annealing process is quite limited, or actually very limited, in the types of problems it can solve. It can do binary optimization really, really, really well, and that's kind of about it. You have to play a bunch of tricks to kind of do other things. People, in terms of simulating materials, have actually completely ignored the D-Wave as a credible platform. Most experts, or actually all experts in the field, had said it's impossible to run these simulations on the D-Wave platform. And we had meetings with electronic structure experts and quantum computing experts at the beginning of the program, and they actually got up in the middle of the meeting and left the room. They said, this is ridiculous. It's never going to work. We're not going to waste our time on it. So as an entrepreneur, we saw that as an opportunity to say, if people say this is impossible, then most likely it means there's actually a way to make it work, and if we can, then there's incredible value. So what did we do? We went out and we made it work. And while we've been able to simulate these small problems, up to water, which is still the largest to date published simulation on a quantum computer, we were able to do it with a higher degree of accuracy, higher degree of theory than IBM and other teams were able to achieve using D-Wave, which again is another fantastic partner for the CDL program, and we have to thank them immensely for being, opening up their platform, and we hope that they continue to participate along with Rigetti in future years. We've been able to simulate far larger, far more complex materials that are getting us very close to the edge of these industrial relevant problems. So we've been able to simulate benzene, and benzene is very significant because it's the fundamental building block of most organic chemistry. So if we look at a material that goes into an organic LED display, a fine chemical, pharmaceuticals, pesticides, advanced polymers, and composites, most of these materials are built on a number of different benzene rings put together in different ways with a few other functional atoms. And so the fact that we're able to simulate that benzene building block means that we're now very close to being able to take some of these more complicated materials, decompose them, run them through in parts, put it back together, and have a full commercially relevant simulation on quantum hardware. And so we had some breakthroughs in the last kind of month to make this possible. And so this has taken me personally as a skeptic of, is this years or decades away, to something that's potentially months away based on the current pace of hardware development. But what gets us more excited is that when we actually look at the results of the simulation. So when you actually do these simulations, both classically and on the quantum processing unit, you kind of prime it with an initial set of random values, and it goes through a bunch of stuff, and it gives you back a guess, and that guess is wrong. It's close, it's some error away from the final answer, and you have to iterate, and you go through many, many iterations. And so classically, it could take you 10,000, 100,000, a million iterations to go from that initial guess all the way down to the kind of final ground state solution to your problem. And so what was really exciting about the simulations that we started running on the D-Wave system were that the first guess it gave us back, and it gave us the first guess pretty quick, gives you a value back, was 2 times more accurate than what we were getting off of the highly, highly optimized CPU code base, and 3 times more accurate than off the highly, highly optimized GPU code base. And when I say highly optimized, these are code bases that are written in Fortran, a language that most programmers today could not work with because they've forgotten how. But it gives us very incredible speed, and it's been developed over 40 years, versus our first generation, alpha 0.1 version held together by duct tape of our QPU-based code already showed us that we could get this significant quantum advantage. And so we see the potential for a very beautiful hybrid approach in the near term where we could, for example, take an initial guess off of the quantum system and then do all of the rest of the work classically. But by at least having that initial guess being so much closer to the final answer, it gives us very significant benefit in terms of the speed up by cutting off tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of potential iterations. But that's not all. When we started running the simulations, say, okay, well, we're running the simulation and we're interested in designing materials. So we have to take those simulations and extract physical properties from them. And when we started doing that and comparing the values that we were getting back from the same simulation, same level of theory, run on the classical, highly optimized systems, highly optimized code space, to the quantum method, we were finding that the result coming back from the quantum simulation was so much closer, was both basically almost exactly matched the actual experimental value measured in the real world by scientists, versus the classical simulation was actually very far away. In some cases it has, for the case of water, and we did this as, not just because it's a small example, but because it's a very highly studied system and something that's very important for logic. Most chemical reactions are kind of done in water and kind of biological systems. And we can see in this case that the actual classical simulation is something like almost 50% inaccurate from the actual experimental value, versus the quantum method is very, very close. And so this excited us immensely that not only are we having a quantum advantage in terms of the initial guess being that much better and being able to reduce all of those unnecessary iterations in the calculation, but the actual result is better and a more meaningful representation of the physical world. which means that this is a much better approach to actually design materials computationally. And so as a company, we're developing advanced materials. We came to the CDL with the hope of being able to demonstrate that this was maybe feasible. And we've kind of exceeded all of those expectations in what we've been able to achieve in just the last 6 to 7 months. And originally our plan was to go out, raise our Series B at the end of this year. But based on these results alone, we're going to move that timeline up. And so we're looking for a couple of very visionary investors to join us in our Series B round to be able to help us incorporate this early result into our production workflow. And so we believe this is months away from being able to demonstrate quantum advantage in the first real business application of quantum computing. Thank you. Can you put it back up? Can you put the slide back up?
All right, thanks very much, Michael. Jordy?
So there's one more thing, though. One more thing. So obviously, everyone looks at this chart and says, OK, that's all nice and good. You've shown quantum advantage. You've shown you've gotten to this benzene that's an important building block. And OK, let's assume the hardware stays the same. How long is it going to take you to actually get to those industrially relevant size problems? Well, we've already done all of these. And they work beautifully. So we're already there on today's hardware. We can do the industrially size relevant problems. We can see quantum advantage. And because this is now at the tipping point, every single improvement in hardware, software, and theory only gives us that much larger advantage over the classical approach. Thank you.
OK, thanks, Michael.